Hershey Park is one of the best amusement parks in the country, and it consists of plenty of chocolate and one of the most complete coaster lineups out there. On top of that, they already had a bunch of fantastic rides, but Hershey decided to add a new hypercoaster for 2020, Candymonium. Spoiler alert, it's pretty high on this list, but if you want a more in-depth look at the new for 2020 B&M, check out my coaster review. Now, I consider this to be one of my home parks because I tend to go there at least once a year and I've ridden everything countless times. But what coaster ranks supreme in the land of the sweets? Let's find out. Batting leadoff for us is Coco Cruiser. Now this is a common clone of the Zamperla family gravity coaster. It's a small, smooth kiddie coaster that's, necessary for every park just to get the kids started. There's not really much else to say here, so let's move on. The first large-scale coaster on this list is the original GCI that opened up in 1996. And to say that Wildcat has aged well, that's not true. This Woody features a twister-style layout with some helices, small airtime hills, and it now runs on the new Millennium Flyer trains from GCI. The new trains definitely help a little bit with the comfort. They're well padded versus the PTC trains that used to run on the track. But either way, this ride still throws riders around throughout the layout. And Hershey should really just call up RMC or maybe even GCI to introduce the last major missing coaster from this park, a hybrid. Coming in at number 12 is a compact Mack Rides creation. Wild Mouse is one of those standard Wild Mouse models. These clones focus on lateral forces as the small cars wrap around the unbanked track, and odds are you've ridden a similar model somewhere else. There's plenty of these built in parks all over the place. Now, it's above Wildcat just because Wildcat's really rough, and although there really isn't anything that sets this clone apart, it's still better, but it still lands at number 12. Speaking of rides with similar models, the park's Arrow Mine Train Trailblazer is another necessary cog in the lineup, a solid family coaster that, is a little larger than the kiddie coaster and it's mostly smooth, besides some potholes here and there, but it does supply some fun forces. The ride also has some small interactions with Stormrunner, and there's a nice tunnel into the final breaks. Unlike the Wild Mouse, this coaster sets itself apart from other mine trains with these interactions, and being surprisingly smooth, but it's still not very special. Next up, and rounding out the top 10, is the first vertical loop on the east side of the US, Superdooperlooper. This was personally my first inverting coaster, and it was built by Schwarzkopf in 1977. It features a single vertical loop with a section of track that runs through the loop. This coaster rides around the area, interacting with the log flume, Great Bear, and a tunnel. As is the case with most Schwarzkopfs, the loops are pretty intense and forceful, and overall this ride is fun, but it still sits in the family level of thrill, I'd say, and it's probably the best way to introduce a kid into inversions. Now I know what you're thinking. I know tons of enthusiasts see boomerangs and they just roll their eyes, and they ride them once for the credit and that's it. However, like Trailblazer, this ride does something different than the other similar models, and it really stands out. It has the one advantage, and that is it features the new Vekoma vest restraints, and it removes all the headbanging from this ride, especially on the Cobra roll. Now, it's still a boomerang, but it's the best standard boomerang out there. And come on, backwards through a Cobra roll on a vertical loop is still fun, no matter how many times you do it. Man, Hershey just knows how to do family supporting coasters. An indoor spinning coaster from Maurer Rides, Laff Trackk sends you through a dark building lit by neon that's showered in blacklight. The ride itself has some really fun moments. It includes some highly banked turns all along a butter smooth track while you spin. Now, this is certainly more intense than the Wild Mouse, and it's great for everyone to ride. The spinning is not too crazy, and it should not make you feel nauseous unless you have an extremely weak stomach. The only real knock here is the ride's small capacity in a park that has a lot of other small capacity rides. The oldest operating coaster in the park is Comet. The classic wooden coaster runs over the river and now has Skyrush twisted over and around it. Some people are very high on Comet and they compare it to other rides like Phoenix at Knoebels, but unfortunately I don't have it quite as high as that. It's a lot of fun, no doubt, and it supplies some fun airtime over its layout, but I think it's a bit rougher than people lead on and the forces aren't really anything special. Overall, I get off this ride shrugging and smiling. Fun but forgettable, especially when compared to those higher on the list. Next up on the list is the dueling coaster at the park. It's another GCI, Lightning Racer. Now this opened up in the year 2000, and unfortunately my enjoyment for this ride is pretty dependent on whether or not you get that dueling aspect. The forces are weak throughout, and the ride isn't rough, but it isn't really smooth either, and overall the best part of the ride is watching the other train run by. Fortunately, dueling on this coaster is pretty common. I find it pretty rare you don't get that. But as we go through the layout, I do find myself with every interaction watching the other train go by and wanting to reach out. The experience really elevates this ride, and I think that's why it's better than Comet, even if Comet has the better forces. But without that, it's a pretty weak GCI. Now the real fun begins, the top of the crop. Number 5 is the unique B&M Invert Great Bear. This is one of the oddest feeling inverted coasters out there. It features a pre-drop helix, weird supports over the river, and some unfortunate straight track. However, this ride is really smooth, it's pretty whippy, especially in the back, and the rides over the midways, over the river, and the other coasters never fail to entertain. My hot take for this ride is that I think it's better than Raptor at Cedar Point. Not by too much, but it definitely is for me. It's simply much more memorable for some reason, and it isn't any higher on this list because it doesn't have that real standout element that makes your jaw drop like some of the other rides do. Moving on from a unique B&M to an odd Intamin coaster, Fahrenheit looks like if a Maverick was mixed with a Gerstlauer Infinity coaster. A vertical lift is really the spotlight here that drags in guests, but the biggest plus on this ride is the ending. The end of the short ride comes right after the Cobra Roll. It features back-to-back corkscrews that are taken really fast, and it's followed by an airtime hill that really, like the first drop, whips you out of your seat. You get some really great ejector that I don't think a lot of people expect on this ride. My one con for this ride, besides the length, is that there's one rough spot, and it's as you come out of that Cobra Roll. It doesn't really throw you around or anything like that, it just has a very substantial rattle when the train goes over. But other than that, the ride is phenomenal, it's smooth everywhere else, and it's a real shame there aren't more of these coasters. Stormrunner is never talked about when the best launch coasters are brought up, and I really don't know why. Now it's not Maverick, I give it that, but in terms of hydraulic launch coasters, this ride is one of, if not the best. Sure, it's one of the smallest in height and slowest, but the launch is powerful, 0 to 72 in 2 seconds, and it actually has elements after its top hat. The ride enters a Cobra Loop and a Flying Snake Dive. Unique elements that really do feel awesome, they're forceful, and they'll leave you smiling every time you get off the ride. Unfortunately, this ride suffers from the common hydraulic launch downtime, but that's every other hydraulic launch coaster. But this ride really is a must ride anytime you're in the park. Oh, and the dramatic guy saying, "Get ready, here we go," is super cheesy in the beginning, but I absolutely love it. Now this was by far the hardest choice on this list, and for those who saw my Candymonium review, you kind of knew it was already coming, but Skyrush is a world-class ejector airtime machine that is unlike anything around. The prototype wing Intimate Hyper has really bad restraints, no other way to put it, but other than that, wow. It tries to black you out on its first turn following a great drop, and then throws you out of your seat multiple times, specifically those two airtime hills that cross over each other, and by the time you race through the brakes at the end, it typically leaves you breathless and shocked at what just happened. The ride is seemingly getting a bit rougher as it ages. It's more so shakiness. I don't really remember that being there, but I think it's more so just the extreme forces than any real roughness. Now, I know there are plenty of enthusiasts who will prefer this to the number 1, but for now it sits at number 2 for me, but that could change in the future. Finally, we have the new for 2020, the chocolate coaster, Candymonium. This ride is glossy smooth, filled with long floater airtime moments and some uniqueness not found on other B&M hypers. The ride actually has some themes to it as well, with a giant ride sign in the front, the Kisses fountain that it wraps around during the ride, and a colorful station that actually makes it interesting to sit through. The clamshell restraints are as comfy as ever, even with the seatbelt, and there's not a bad spot to sit in the train. The first camelback supplies about 5 seconds of straight floater if you sit towards the front, and the wave turn after feels a lot different than other airtime hills on hypers, and it bucks you up out of your seat. While it may lack the intensity of a Skyrush, the first helix has some kick to it, and despite 2 trim brakes throughout the ride, it's absolutely a world-class ride. Not to mention, it really chews through guests in a park that's lacking a lot of capacity machines. Now, if you want a more detailed dive into this ride, its layout, and other features, check out my full review. So that's going to wrap things up at this Candy Park coaster ranking. Which rides would you move around, and which ride would you want to see added next to this park? Leave your comments below, and make sure to check out Island Coasters on Instagram for daily content. That's going to be all for today. See you next time from the shores of Island Coasters.